Welcome to the Health System CIO Show. I'm your host, founder, and editor Anthony Guerra. On today's episode, I will be speaking with Dr. J. Scott Smitherman, VP and CMIO with Providence. Dr. Smitherman, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
All right, excellent. So, congratulations. This is interesting to start our conversation. So, a new position for you, but certainly not a new organization. Coming up almost on 20 years. Been in informatics leadership a long time, but got the CMIO role now. So, congratulations. And
You?
tell me a little bit about sort of the career evolution. Obviously, you had an interest in this from way back when.
Yeah, absolutely. I joined Providence in 2008 as a internist, practicing just kind of traditional internal medicine, admitting my own patients to the hospital. And I like to joke that, it's one of those cases of you show up to the wrong committee too many times, they put you in charge. I was, as somebody who's always been interested in, the power of technology. Signed up for the IT committee at the hospital and ultimately helped Providence along with its a long and complex journey towards electronic medical records. And then moved into a role where I was helping both the outpatient world as well as the employed medical group as the CMIO, and now in this new role, I'm responsible for physician and APP informatics, both inpatient and outpatient across our, large organization, our 50 plus hospitals, 1,000 clinic sites, from Texas up to Alaska.
Excellent. So, you've got a long tenure. As you mentioned, you've been doing this a while. In your post that you put up on LinkedIn, you sounded really happy, very excited, dream job type situation. Um, and it made me think of, someone who's been around as long as you've been and seen some of the, I guess we could say mistakes were made, uh, over the course of implementing technology around meaningful use. Um, it didn't a lot of times make physicians' lives easier, right? If certain things had to be done, a lot of documentation got put on doctors. And I guess we could say that things didn't go as well as they could have. Do you feel like moving forward, having lived through some of that, also as a user, not just an implementer, but as a user, um, that you see some things that you don't want to do again, things we need to stay away from? Now, I know some of those things were required. You had no choice. But your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, I am very, enthusiastic about the power of technology here. I absolutely feel like we take better care of patients now with all of the information available than we did. I mean, I'm old enough to remember seeing a patient in the, emergency room of a hospital in Houston, Texas, with nothing but the patient's recollection of their medical problems and medications, and having to make a very complex medical judgment based on very little information, or having to try to get that out of the unintelligible doctor scribble from somebody, that if I could get a note or a copied faxed note from somebody. And so, I mean, clearly, the amount of information that is at my fingertips now when I sit down in front of the vast majority of my patients is just exponentially larger. So, but it doesn't help me take care of that patient faster. And of course, medicine has evolved with all of the, regulatory and payer pressure. And our doctors are definitely feeling overwhelmed by it all. The amount of administrative burden that doesn't let them concentrate on just the human interaction with the patient in front of them, which is a big piece of why I'm excited to be in this role right now, because we're not just implementing EMRs, as I said in the post. We're not just giving technology to doctors who may or may not want it. We are really doing some amazing stuff right now that is focused on letting doctors kind of focus on the patient in front of them, helping. The torrent is not stopping their patient. There's more, messages coming to doctors in basket. There's more information you have to try to digest while you're seeing the patient. But for, kind of the world of AI, for the first time, we have some tools that really do have the ability to help here. There's lots of, caveats to that. We have to do it right. And it can't be just another burden. And it is one of my big fears as you talk about do we as a country do this wrong, not as a health system, but our whether regulatory agencies or payers are using AI too, and not always to the benefit of physicians and APPs and taking care of patients. So there is a potential for more burden to be placed on it, but. Here at Providence, we've been a leader in using, the ambient technology that is becoming kind of a household thing now, where, we take the burden of writing a note. I mean, I always explain to non-physicians, imagine, you have 20 meetings in your day, and after every meeting, you have to generate a two-page report about that has to stand up to legal scrutiny, patient scrutiny, et cetera. And most of us back in school, if we got a two-page essay written in a single day, we were pretty proud of ourselves. And now,
That's right.
we're asking doctors to do it to 20 to 50 times a day, depending on their practice. And the large language model based AI charting absolutely take that burden. And so now I sit down in front of a patient, I can look them in the eye, knowing that my records are being taken care of while I talk to them. And I think there's a lot. We're just scratching the surface now because writing a note is one thing, but actually helping take other pieces of that burden of if you start talking about your heart failure. It's some of this is future oriented, but it's absolutely within the realm of the possible where the AI is going to be surfacing your last echocardiogram, your last note with the cardiologist. So I don't have to go look for those things. It just, will show up, as well as, providing any, clinical guidance. There's too much for doctors to have to keep in their head these days. And, having a buddy where I'm still making the decision as a physician, but it's, surfacing either suggestions or relevant recent articles that I might not know about based on just, nothing besides the conversation between me and the patient. That's really exciting.
Yeah, what you're saying, I mean, it makes me think about governance and the importance of governance in trying to improve the clinician's life. So a couple things, and then you can go wherever you want with this. So one of the dynamics you described is sort of like a famine to feast in terms of data. You've gone from having to manually try and put the picture together to somewhat being overwhelmed by sort of a tsunami of information. Now we have AI that can assist with going through that sometimes mess and bringing out the relevant information in a succinct way for the clinician as it pertains to what they're doing at the moment. What we know, and this is where I think we come into conversations about model drift and things like that, that it's not perfect. And that's a problem in healthcare, right? I mean, when I'm doing something and interacting with an AI and, I'm like, well, this looks wrong. And it goes, oh, yeah, you make a good point. Like, okay, great. I make a good point. Why do you keep getting it wrong? So it's not, I mean, that's the dynamic that just kills me. You're like, well, what about this? But this doesn't make sense. And it goes, oh, yeah, that's a great point. And you get a little frustrated. So, that's obviously more problematic if it's summarizing a note or things like that. And a physician goes, but what about this? I remember this. And it goes, oh, yeah. So it's not perfect, but it's obviously a huge help and it'll get better and better and better, which is wild as the underlying models change. So, you're doing some kind of work, you're getting an output of, let's say, an 8 out of 10. They go to the next model and you're getting a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10. So the models keep advancing underneath the process you're working on. I brought up governance because, kind of a bit of what you were talking about is there's a lot that we can do. There's a lot of directions we can go in. And so we need to figure out what to do next. And then you have the idea of workflow, right? So we can want to do a thing, but it's got to be smooth in the workflow. It can't require a complete, be sort of a jarring to the physician, like, oh, we fixed this for you, but you got to go here or you got to go there. And they say, no, 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 that's not going to work for me. So wherever you want to take all that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we here at Providence are, absolutely focused. We have on patient safety with all of this and appropriate and ethical use of AI. We have a robust AI guardrails process, but it is absolutely a challenge because this space is moving so fast, and healthcare is a kind of notoriously large ship to turn, and I work in a very large organization, which is amazing in that we have lots of resources to dedicate to AI, but it's a big deal for us to experiment with something and have to do it in a safe way. To start out with, we are absolutely focused on things like administrative burden, where there is, where some of the issues you talk about with AI, where it's still your doctor making the decision and reviewing your note and all of those things. But you're absolutely right. As these things get, almost paradoxically, as you get to a 9 out of 10, when you're seeing a million patients a day, though that's unacceptable if some of those, if that 99 out of 10 or 999 out of 1,000, if that last one is significant and a patient safety error, we have to be aware of that. But at the same time, we can't sit still because the you have to consider the danger of omission. And if an AI is helping me read the chart, which I couldn't possibly read all of in a 15-minute visit, if you come to see me and you have a 30-year history of multiple medical problems, your doctor doesn't have 3 hours before you walk in to review all of your chart and hopefully in his human way pick out the relevant details. The AI absolutely has the ability to help that process, but of course it has to be safe. Writing a note, yeah, absolutely. There's potential, and we've monitored carefully. Our vendors are very careful at reviewing it and making sure we're doing that safely. But again, the status quo of the mistakes, there's like one of the greatest use cases we're talking about now that once again is clinical but touches on the administrative burden is the discharge summary from a hospital. Most hospitals are run by hospitalists these days, or have a hospitalist on their team. They rotate. So you're a new doctor coming on, or you're new to shift. You come on and you're pulling up on a panel of 30 patients. First patient needs to be discharged, and they've been in the hospital for 3 weeks. How do you possibly summarize that? And over the years, I've read some really bad ones from well-meaning doctors, but who just couldn't possibly synthesize everything that happened in a long hospitalization in the time that they were given to do the work. I'm not somebody who it's kind of always popular in the press to think about is AI going to replace physicians or that sort of thing. I mean, we are so far from that in that with the shortage of physicians and APPs in this country for the care people need, I think there's just huge possibility to make the doctors and APPs that we have be more productive and be able to provide better care. More efficiently with these tools. But we absolutely have to keep the safety issues you highlight at top of mind because the AI is not perfect. It would be great if we lived in a world without hallucinations, as they're called, et cetera, or some of the other errors where that we all have become aware of in dealing with the models that we deal with. But there's huge potential, and we have to consider, the cost of doing nothing, which is just unacceptable these days with the growth of the complexity and administrative burden on our physicians now.
How about some high level thoughts on governance and making sure that you've got the structure in place to make sure that you're doing the next most important thing, based on the strategic objectives of the organization as laid down by the CEO and the board and whatnot. You have, sort of top down direction set in that way. You have bottom up requests that come up from your users, the whole pebble in the shoe thing. So you're finding out you've got information coming from that way. You've got directives coming from the top. You have a very large organization. You have to make sure the right voices are coming together, that all that gets put in a pot, stirred up, and says, here's the next thing we do based on our resources, the strategic objectives, and what we're hearing as far as the user needs and requests. That's got to have like structure around it. I know you have that, but what are your thoughts on what that looks like when done well? that people can take some thoughts, some of our IT executives that listen, and try and figure out if there's something missing from their own governance process that might be holding them back.
Well, first off, Anthony, this is absolutely why you hear the enthusiasm in my, like LinkedIn post about this. This is, I love living in this space because nowadays, whether it is bottom up priorities or top down, it's very hard to accomplish much at a healthcare organization without involving informatics and IT in it because any initiative of significance in some way involves our EMR and our electronic tools. We're just right in the middle of it, and I get to be one of the voices at the table that helps put those things together, help the senior leadership come up with the strategy, but implement their strategy as well. Be the voice of a practicing physician myself to bring to understand how these tools affect that day-to-day person-to-person interaction, and how important something that may seem pretty minor to somebody at the senior level, but if I can, take that pebble out of the shoe, yeah, your day is a lot better if we can fix that, cut off a few clicks here or there. So absolutely, I like living, in this space as a leader. Um, but it's hard. It is definitely hard. We've got a CEO that's absolutely committed to administrative burden, for, reducing administrative burden to physician APPs and helping our docs, again, focus on healthcare. We have some high level initiatives around that have been set at the senior level through our Office of Transformation, uh, to really focus on, increasing the use of Ambient, to start out with physicians and APPs, but we also plan to, deploy that to nursing. As again, there's significant limitations in the workforce there in the future, and potential to reduce administrative burden for nurses as well. As well as I touched on it earlier, the burden of in-basket messages coming in, whether it be just results and all the things that we pass to doctors now, as well as the messages that come from patients, et cetera. You mentioned meaningful use and the expansion that has included patient portals, which when done right absolutely help doctors better connect with their patients. But the net result has been that doctors get this kind of deluge of messages from patients, that we never would have done in the past. When a patient called the office, they never passed the phone back to the doctor unless it was something super crisis, right? But nowadays it is very common when a patient sends a message that they just forward it along to the doctor and say, please advise. And there's a lot of reasons for that are both human and technological. So we've developed tools to help, just categorize messages, so a very safe use case where we categorize them, not even, and so if it looks like it's a referral message, maybe we can have the referral team look at that first and not forward it on to a doctor to make a decision about. And so, because our doctors are so good natured in wanting to help their patients that sometimes we have to not get the messages to them where we because they will try to solve the patient's problem no matter what, but again, we're burning out our primary care physicians and APPs in particular with kind of tasks that really aren't doctor tasks. We want to absolutely get their clinical input when clinical input is required, or get the patient seen in an appropriate setting. A lot of times patients send us messages and it would really be more appropriate for a virtual visit. If we can create those channels so that you send me a message about something that's bothering you, rather than forwarding to that doctor to see if I can, maybe appropriately treat you over email. Like, if, no, this sounds like something we could get you into a virtual visit right now. We have those services available and we could actually talk to you about your problem. And, there's issues with compensation and how patients pay for it, et cetera. But, that's just, again, fun to be in the middle of those things, because we do have to put it together with all the human processes with the technological processes to make that work. Um, Getting back to your kind of original question about governance, and we're looking at it because, yeah, Providence is complex because there are so many decisions that, a senior leader, even somebody who's really connected like myself can't make. You need to talk to you need to talk to the service line that really knows. So we have lots of, service line oriented where we get the people that act, kind of to my very first point of view, the doctors that are interested and willing to come to a committee to talk to but you need those voices and you have to cultivate that as an organization, whether it be super users or in many cases paid positions, because you can't just rely on doctors' goodwill and to show up to a committee.
Right. That's
Yeah,
a good point.
you have to be willing to invest in that in terms of, and it takes lots of different forms, whether it's, formal medical directors to, super user programs, and we've got some wonderful ones both for physicians and non-physician clinicians, so that we pay for pieces of their time to come to those meetings. And a small healthcare organization might be able to get by with, the senior doctor who can walk the halls or whatever. But in a large organization like ours, we need, governance does have to be somewhat slow at times because you can't, make a change just because a doctor in Alaska wants it, and that may or may not be right for our clinics in California. And we have a very standardized system across our organization, and we make decisions together. But it does mean that it sometimes is slow. So the challenge is maintaining the agility of an organization as well as the trade-offs. We have all these wonderful structures that are mostly service line oriented, and then you have to, but that may or may not match with the IT resources that are responsible for building the thing. And a great example is, say, our lab team. We have lots of projects, whether it be exploring new relationships with vendors like LabCorp, where we have to build something internally because we've changed how the business is done. But that may then mean that we don't have those same lab, IT resources to build to build a new order set that would help a doctor change practice. So balancing those kind of day-to-day business needs with the need for transformation. And I think organizations have to think about that, because once again, you can't stand still on transformation. You can't just say, I'm going to just keep the lights on today, because that's stagnation is not acceptable in healthcare. The things are changing too fast, and there's enough, evidence-based practice changes, and you can't have a system that, has an order set for a drug that is no longer recommended by, appropriate governance bodies. So you have to be keeping that in mind as you go along. So, we're really, we've kept an inventory of all of our governance groups and thinking about how those groups fold up and are formally chartered to who gets to make the final decision, because you don't want it to just be IS, and in many organizations it kind of ultimately ends up being, because IS ends up making decisions because they're sort of triaging the resources, but you want to be reflecting that senior level priority and strategy, as well as but you do have to keep the lights on, because there are changes that come from Epic or our various vendors that we have no choice but to do if we want to keep our systems running.
You mentioned an inventory of governance groups. One of the issues that's always fascinated me is who who in a health system, or how do we make sure that we have a flexible approach to governance? That governance is very important, and establishing committees and procedures and processes, but they're not always going to be perfect. And as things change over time and technology changes and mandates change and everything changes, governance is going to have to change too. Committees are going to have to change. People are going to have to be come off. People are going to have to be put on. Sometimes that's going to be based on position. It could possibly be based on personality. It could be someone that's just not working out on this committee. They every time we have a meeting, it's a problem. We're not getting anything done. So I wonder how does governance stay flexible in an organization? Because I would imagine that's very important.
Absolutely. And, it's, yeah, I mean, whether it be something as simple as a new CEO or a new leader, we, comes in and then they have many times very well-meaning, create groups to execute their vision, that then step on the toes of groups that already exist. And you do have to change, but at the same time, you don't want to mess up what's working. When you have a group
Right.
of concerned doctors who've shown up and made good decisions for 10 years, like you don't want to blow up that group. I've run committees here, and I've laughingly, said it keeps outlasting the groups that sponsor it. That a group that ran ambulatory governance for our EMR. We had a wonderful group of doctors who were representative from across our organization who showed up and gave us good input, and it kept being effective in spite of the fact that we reorganized the medical group several times over that 10 or 15 years. But you do have to just kind of keep cultivating that garden, because many times doctors are willing to show up, or clinicians across your organization are willing to show up to governance groups, even unpaid, if they're making meaningful decisions. And and that's often the challenge of informatics, of making sure that those groups have meat to dig into, because if it just becomes a report out meeting where you tell them, hey, these are changes coming from Epic or something like that, and they're not, then people will stop coming. But I don't know that I can say much more than you just have to be intentional about it. And as I said, even just having, shocking the number of healthcare systems that probably couldn't even come up with an inventory of all their governance groups, in that, who decided this, and if somebody has a checkbook, they got to build something, and then that's how IT ends up in this, many cases, needing to rationalize their applications because they're supporting, 30 different which of things that all do the same thing, but people with check writing privileges bought something somewhere else. So, it starts at the top with our, leadership, whether that be IS leadership or the very senior leadership, kind of insisting that things are done in a certain way, that we have clear decision rights, and that I give Providence a lot of credit for kind of insisting from the very beginning of our Epic project that, to the greatest extent possible, we were going to try to do things in the best way and only vary when it made sense to vary, as opposed to
Hmm.
vary because a strong personality in one service area wanted X, and somebody else wanted Y. Can I say we're perfect in that? No, but we've managed to build a very standard EMR, which then helps us go, the whole go further together analogy, by, because now I can deploy, if a new and exciting AI vendor comes in and we're going to do something, because I have a standard tool to bolt that onto, we can do so much more than we could if every region was doing their own thing and we had to somehow try to integrate it in a bunch of different environments. But there can be frustration because, if you're the individual region who wants to do something, it can feel like the system is slowing you down by insisting that you build it for everybody. And they're like, well, I don't want to build it for everybody. I just want to build it for me. And I got a grant from my foundation to do this. So why aren't you mean IT letting me do this? And having, getting those people to the appropriate conversations to understand that they can do more if they do it, with the system is an important part of my role.
Excellent, excellent, very good. So, you mentioned tools and things like that. I know you had a major undertaking, Project Pixel, where you're bringing on the about 12 to 14, I've seen different numbers quoted, sort of AI type tools from Epic, and you've been working on those and turning those on. So, we're seeing a lower appetite for point solutions outside of the core EHR suite. Uh, we're definitely seeing that. It's a pendulum. I've been around a little while, and it's been a pendulum. I think when I started, it was a best of breed approach. Hey, let's get the best tools and we'll stitch them together. And over time, that has swung towards uh, staying in suite for sure. We're in a staying in suite phase right now with limited bolt-ons, but everyone says the right things in terms of being willing to bolt something on when it's necessary. To me, the interesting part is in the gray area of making those decisions. I assume a lot of these things are kicked off by a request for a tool from a put it this way, a highly influential user slash clinician slash surgeon, someone who's very influential and would came across a tool and said, "This looks great. I would like this." And then that kicks off some sort of process where that gets over to IT, and it's got to go through some kind of pipeline, ideally, of evaluation. And what is this? And do you really need this? Do we have this? Do we have this in suite? Do we have it? Could we get it out of suite? That's almost the last resort of getting that point solution. If it happens to pass all of the cybersecurity tests and we think we can integrate it, and then it's got to pass sort of workflow tests. There's a whole process of evaluation that has to go on to make those decisions. And I'd like your thoughts. Obviously, you're going deeply all in with Epic, as many are. Epic first. I've seen all different kinds of ways of expressing it. Epic first, but not Epic. Different phrases people put on it, but the sentiment is the same. So, what can you tell us about how that dynamic works? Those requests. Obviously, you're going deep on Epic, and anything you want to tell us about Project Pixel.
Yeah, I think the main element is you just approach any project with eyes wide open about what the real cost is going to be. And it doesn't matter whether it's Epic's feature or a bolt-on that so many times, folks have an idea. Like I said, they've gotten a grant from their foundation to build something or what have you, and but they're not thinking of what it's going to cost to maintain this thing ad infinitum if we were to build it, and or an individual doctor sees maybe a screening tool that
Hmm.
a new company comes and screen for a certain condition using an iPad in their clinic, and you got to, well, in many cases they don't care what it costs to buy the iPads and integrate the software and keep it integrated and the licensing costs, all those things. So you just need to approach all of that with a fully loaded eye, and it will make plenty of sense to integrate third-party solutions in a lot of cases, and of course we've done that. Um, Obviously, it seems to have been a piece of the secret sauce for Judy and Epic to never integrate internally, to build everything so that everything works well together, and customers like me don't have to. If we choose an Epic product, I don't have to worry about the integration piece. It just is. And sometimes there's an additional licensing cost or there's not. Obviously, the beauty of Epic is kind of working with some of its AI products to make it very financially attractive for organizations. If we could just use the Epic product to go with the Epic product, and Epic is often not first into any space, whether it be AI or any other feature in their suite, but they're somewhat relentless at improving their product, and many times organizations, um, you know, the IT leaders don't get in trouble if they for deploying the Epic solution because it just kind of continually gets better, and it may be not exactly what you wanted to start out with, but they do, I do think for all the negative press they get, they are relentless in trying to improve their product, and in many cases by version 2 or version 3 it's absolutely competitive with the third party solutions, again without that burden to IT shops to integrate it. So Project Pixel is just our internal name for looking at all of AI, all of the AI things that Epic is putting out. And I think I give kudos to Epic for diving into this space for all the reasons you and I've talked about already. Do I think that are all of their features appropriate? No, we've tried some of them and not found their version 1 to once again in our safe approach to AI. Some of the features we've kind of looked at and said either we don't think that's ready for prime time yet, or it's not really even just going to save our doctors time. But we're going to watch development of it because in many cases those features are the easiest for us to deploy because I don't have to negotiate with another company. I don't have to maintain an interface. if I can, flip a switch from Epic to turn something on that is very attractive, if it will help our doctors. I think coding is a great example. There's a lot of vendors out there, whether prospective or retrospective or even during the visit, want to provide coding guidance to your physicians. Well, who's better positioned than Epic themselves to give you coding guidance on the notes that you already have in the EMR? Again, are there features that some of the vendors are offering that are absolutely attractive and might and make sense for us to use? Sure, there's things that they do, but right now we're using Epic's coding guidance for the point of care because we could deploy it easily, and it pops her up right in the workflow as you mentioned earlier. So I'm not having physicians open another window to think about AI coding review. It's just right there where they would put in their code normally in Epic. And there's a lot of features like that Epic is deploying, AI, and because they own the interface, are able to put it right at the right where the doctor is anyway. So it's an easy thing to do. So we found quite a number of features that have been quite helpful, and I'm excited to as Epic continues along the line. And but it's competition like any other. If somebody builds a better mousetrap, we're absolutely willing to consider it. But there is an advantage, yes, to having something that's built into your workflow without that the maintenance tail that would come with a third party product.
So this brings us back to governance, where these decisions and all these weightings, some of which are, I think, as you said, can be seemingly irrelevant to the clinician requesting the tool. They don't particularly care about integration issues and underlying issues and cybersecurity and long-term costs. They should, and it'll have to be explained to them. But the evaluation of all those factors has to be done by a governance committee that is cross-discipline, with folks like yourself, folks that are sort of more on the CTO side, like real, CIO, CTO side, the pure technology side, and the clinical side, weighing these things, looking sometimes at the Epic product timeline, the current usability. You have to know enough about the specific workflow and needs of that clinician to decide, because I've heard the term 80%. Well, we're going to go with Epic if it's got 80% functionality. Well, who's deciding? That's got to be someone that understands that clinician's life. Can't be the CIO that's saying, we think it's good enough for you, Dr. So-and-so. So you need that governance in order to make those decisions that can be reviewed every 6 months or every year, because as for example, the Epic product evolved. What was 70% could now be 80%, could be 85%. Again, it's not going to be the CIO that puts a number on usability. And that's got to be explained back to the clinician with some degree of transparency. It's not just a no, it's a, well, here's what's going on. We have the right mix of people looking at this, weighing everything, and making a decision. Currently, it's no, but this will be reviewed. Am I right in thinking that this is how this has to go?
No, absolutely. And again, it's a piece of why I love my role is
Yeah.
that, I have that credibility to go and, I take care of patients. I understand, what it's like to have IT tools fail me at the point of care, or to wish I had something. And so I can go have that conversation with clinical leaders, with credibility, and partner with my fellow IT executives to have those conversations and make appropriate trade-offs. Because you're absolutely right. It's not appropriate for a non-clinician to say something, I mean, even when we're not talking Epic, we're talking hard IT, but to understand the clinical impact of something we might do or not do, both investment or, a security change or something like that. Even to something as simple as having to, implement email policies, et cetera, understanding how our clinicians in our hospital use, their private email accounts that are tied to their small business, that they run in their private practice. We have to understand those things and be able to have those conversations in a way that, somebody who's not in that space doesn't necessarily understand. And then, yes, having that conversation with somebody that, hey, I know you saw vendor X doing something new and exciting. That's absolutely on the Epic roadmap. You're going to get it for free basically next year versus we could drop everything and we could work on that, which would mean you would get nothing else. So, I think a big piece of our challenge that we've discussed in our in our governance group inventory that we were talking about is kind of relaying that rhythm of business of IT to the organization because we are delivering so many things, whether it be Epic Pixel or other upgrades so that leaders understand what we are doing. And then a big piece of the challenge is then when they bring us new ideas, whether it be leaders from above or things that bubble up from below, that we're positioned to kind of adequately give them the choices that they would have to make. Because obviously we could spend 3 times as much money as we're spending on IT if we wanted to. And but that's not the world we live in. So there will be trade-offs. And if you want to do X, that means, well, Y and Z are going to have to wait. And that's often hard for organizations to do so that, okay, if I'm a medical group leader and I've asked for something, or the committee or what have you, they're often willing to make hard choices. We as doctors have to make hard choices, but we have to be able to tell them what they're deciding against, so that okay, if you do this, that means those other upgrades you've asked for won't happen until next year.
Hmm.
And it's often not no, but it's a not now, or let's just put it in line, and that's we'll continuously reevaluate our priorities, not necessarily even on a yearly basis. And that's another piece of the challenge, of course, is matching yearly budgets to timelines that stretch over longer, either shorter or longer than yearly budgets. Sometimes, investments need to be made now and you need to be agile enough to do that. But there's also issues where you want to keep something going, or it's going to require multiple years of kind of investment to get done.
Yeah, you've also got an MBA, we should say for the audience. So you've got quite a lot of credibility. You've got the financial credibility with the CFO type folks. You've got the clinical credibility, and you've got the IT credibility. So you're pretty much firing on all cylinders over there. Quite
We hope so,
impressive.
yes.
Quite impressive. Um, all right, Dr. Smitherman, as a final question, I'll put it to you this way. What's your advice to, let's say, newly minted, again, you're a newly minted CMIO, but you've been doing this work at an executive level for a long time. You just got the title now. Um, what's your advice to either aspiring or newly minted um, CMIO types? Uh, Obviously, they want to be successful. What do you think have been some of the keys to your success, and that you plan to continue sort of engaging in going forward?
The you can't say yes to everything, which is of every kind of opportunity, but you do have to get involved. I remember our former CEO Rod Hochman saying, yeah, that he never said no to any new opportunity that was presented to him as a young executive. In that you have to be willing to kind of show up to the committee meeting, as I said, and even stuff that maybe is out of your wheelhouse, to learn about it, because many times I'm just there, you know, to get an understanding of how the business works so that I can help, them understand how the IT part works, but also I can hear the needs of my organization, and therefore when it comes time to advise the organization on investment, I know. And so, showing up, paying attention in whatever forms you can be, from just medical staff leadership to obviously the IT focused type meetings, is just absolutely key for young folks. And then, it definitely is hard to get, to find roles, because there's not like lots of full-time CMIO jobs,
Hmm.
more common than it used to be. But it's, if you're a young informatics oriented doctor, finding ways to get involved, like we have a physician builders program where doctors can, kind of learn about the nuts and bolts of Epic, which is great when they actually build stuff and, help us kind of, build things that are appropriate for their area, but also so that they can build that knowledge about how Epic works, and then, therefore bring better ideas to the organization, because by understanding the nuts and bolts of our IT systems are better in position to advise the organization. So, other than that, it's been, just You gotta love it and and work to stay involved.
Oh, that's great. Dr. Smitherman, this has been an absolute pleasure. I want to thank you for your time today, and I hope we can catch up with you again down the road.
Thank you, Anthony. Let's do it again sometime soon.
All right, have a great day.
You too.